Okay, and let's see, participants.
So now whatever we're saying from here on out is recorded.
It's now on the record.
Yes, so be careful.
Okay, you're now the host.
Yep.
Have a good
Okay,
evening.
thanks, host.
We'll
Okay,
see you,
thanks,
Patty.
Patty.
Thank you.
Yep, bye-bye.
Is everything okay? I missed that. Okay.
There, you're there. Huh.
Yeah, I just realized I didn't have it turned on. Hi, Linda, Matt.
Yeah.
Patty, Dennis.
Did I see that you were at Trinity in Bethlehem?
Yes,
Oh, okay. On Center Street.
you're right, Center and North.
Yeah, okay. I used to be a student there long ago,
Oh,
a student
okay.
pastor with Maria
Oh,
Spada. Yeah,
wonderful.
back in the 90s.
Okay. I hear a lot about her ministry.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. We had our 50th anniversary. I wish I
Really?
would have known that. If I would have known that, I would have invited you to the anniversary.
Wow.
We we had people on the committee that researched all the pastors that were there, but didn't think about student pastors. If I would have known
Yeah,
that.
I was there. I'm trying to think. Maybe 93 and 4,
Oh, okay.
something like that. Yeah, 93, 4, somewhere in there.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That would have been really neat. We had Maria and Frank couldn't make it up,
Yeah.
so that we had them on Zoom.
Oh,
And
nice.
yeah, so it worked out really nice, and everyone got to see her and Frank,
Yeah.
and we put it up on the screen so that she could talk to everyone.
I'll
It
tell
was
you,
really
things have changed. I mean, wow. I should come sometime.
It's nice to have the technology. Well, we don't use the screen since the pandemic's over.
Okay, well,
It's really funny because we utilized it a great deal for music, videos, and things because did not have the organist coming in during the pandemic,
right.
and everything was shut down. So we were doing everything with video and things on the screen, and people enjoyed it. People really liked it. But as soon as it was over and things were back to normal, people were kind of done with that, I guess.
Okay. Done with the screens.
It's-
And here
yeah,
we
it's
are on the
interesting.
screens.
Pardon?
And here we are on the screens.
Yes.
Oh.
Well, yeah, things have changed, and we have a good number of people every Sunday now, and I think most churches do on Zoom who attend by Zoom, and it's great because we have people who have moved to their children during the pandemic because of health concerns, and they were out of state. Our furthest one was Texas, uh, and they could attend every week
Nice.
and see all their friends. Technology has worked out well.
Yeah. Yep, it has. Hi, Suzanne and Sharon and Alan. I'm not sure who's coming or who's not exactly coming.
The only email that I saw was, I know Rebecca said she won't
Right.
be.
Right. And a
And
few
then I know there
people,
was, yeah, I know there was a couple people who said Tuesdays now are no longer
right,
good.
good. So it is 7, so we might as well begin then. And we're here than here. All right, well, anyway, I'm hoping to get through that. We'll get through 3 chapters tonight anyway, so that we can just, I think that Bonnie's going to finish up next week. And that's, where we should go for now. All right, so let us begin with a prayer. Earth maker, pain bearer, life giver, your kingdom come. Empower us to bear the heavens among the earth. Turn us from supremacies, teach us to claim each other as kin, so that love's will may lead us to liberation. Amen. And the scripture chosen for tonight is from 1 John 3, 1-3 and 11-17. And that is, see what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that we do not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And all who have this hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. For this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We must not be like Cain, who was from the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be astonished, brothers and sisters, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brothers and sisters. Whoever does not love abides in death. All who hate a brother or a sister are murderers, and you know that murderers do not have eternal life abiding in them. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for brothers and sisters. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or a sister in need, yet refuses help? And that's the reading for this evening. When we left off with black last week, we talked about white, and we left off and we got to black chapter. And one of the things that Kendai talks about on page 140 and 144 is powerless defense. Let me get back there, sorry. Yes, he says, I thought only white people could be racist and that black people could not be racist because black people did not have power. I thought Latinx, Asians, Middle Easterners, and natives could not be racist because they did not have power. I have no power sense of reactionary history in this construction of its racist bearing. This powerless defense, as I call it, emerged in the wake of racist whites dismissing anti-racist policies and ideas as racist in the late 1960s. The powerless defense does not, and towards the bottom of 140, the powerless defense does not consider people at all levels of power, from policymakers like politicians and executives who have the power to institute and eliminate racist and anti-racist policies, to policy managers like officers and middle managers empowered to execute or hold racist and anti-racist policies. And he's saying every single person actually has the power to protest racist and anti-racist policies, to advance them, and in some small way to stall them. What are your thoughts about that?
I guess for one thing, to me, of course, anyone can be a racist. You don't have to be white.
Yeah. I think in his process of moving into the anti-racist perspective, he is getting in touch with some of his frustration with some of the Black people, like Clarence Thomas, he names him. But there are a number of folks who really, like he says, continue to promote the policies and structures that hold up racism. And I think he's really, as he becomes aware of his own anti-racist concepts and perspectives, this is just glaring in his face.
That we all have some power in this.
Yes.
Yes.
And I guess as these last weeks or whatever, as this book is helping me open my eyes. And when you go somewhere, you think about all this, and it takes time. I mean, I think it takes time to see all this, but
I thought it was interesting how he pushed back on sort of that classic definition of racism, which I think would have been, if you'd have asked me at the very beginning, like what the definition of racism is, I probably would have gone with that one, right? The idea of the prejudice in power, and that's what amounts to racism. And so it was interesting to see him push back on that. Especially in the way that he talked about the dynamics of how power is really the starting point, not the prejudices, and that basically racism ends up becoming a tool to maintain power, not something that it's the way that he sort of switched the cart and the horse around. Felt important to me, because it sort of undid that typical definition of racism that I think we use, especially in the way that then he was able to. I also appreciated how he distinguished between individual racist attitudes and behaviors and the sort of more systemic racism of policies and power structures. I think that was a helpful sort of differentiation that he had in there too.
And one of the things I've been thinking about too is that where do we come up with, where did we learn our racist ideas in our own, in our own mind? Where do we learn these? I had to think about a little too, because
What'd you come up with, Linda?
well, society tells us certain things. TV tells us certain things. I think TV tells us a lot.
But TV and culture could tell us things that are not racist too. They can teach us both sides.
Right.
I think our racist ideas come from the people in power, because they want to stay in power.
And because they believe them.
Well, yeah, at least maybe, yeah.
Okay, well,
I mean, they
Uh,
see it as a tool to, they may not totally believe it, but they use it as a tool to keep in power.
Right, and he's pointed out a lot of those as we've gone, that
I saw, Joe and I watched, for Labor Day, we watched a TCM documentary, or one that was on TCM, about Harlan County, Kentucky, where the coal miners, and how it wasn't racism, but you could see that those those in power were demeaning the workers to keep in power. It's the same formula that's applied in different situations in our culture.
I apologize ahead of time if I cough, because I'm still sick.
Oh,
But when you're talking about where we learn them, I feel like a part of it comes from, and this isn't the full answer, but stereotypes.
mhm.
You know, stereotypes that can seem relatively innocent or descriptive, but end up not being, because they really put us in mindsets.
But fortunately, we have some better role models these days, right, Suzanne? Yeah.
Hopefully. Maybe one or two.
Yeah.
I think there's something to that, though, also in the way that stereotypes are usually the way that we take the simplest answer and generalize it. And I think, because I think so many of our sort of racist beliefs come from the fact of, or come from a place of trying to explain the world as we experience it and as we see it. And I think our instinct is to always try to is to grasp first at the sort of simplest answer available. And that's where it's sort of, what's the media feeding us? What are the people in power feeding us? What are we, whatever. And I mean, I think just in general, humans will take the easiest thing if it's given to them. And I think that's part of where they come from too, is it was the easiest answer given to us to help explain the world as we're experiencing it. And if we haven't thought critically about that, or been given some kind of alternative answer, then we're sort of stuck with that stereotype or that prejudice as we sort of first heard it.
So how do we move beyond that?
Well, I think conversations like this and books like this are helpful, because I think what it's doing is giving us an alternate answer to the questions or to the experiences that we had, and saying it doesn't, the race doesn't have to be the explanation. And I think, you know, that's the thing that certainly, whether implicit or explicitly, that was the answer given to us, was that the explanation was race. And I think this book, and being able to point out the many different ways and aspects in which, no, race is not the explanation. It's and I think this is part of undoing some of that.
I think the difficult thing with this concept, the same with many others, is that the people who may need it the most don't seek it out. Like the people who may benefit the most from learning from a book like this may never pick up a book like this. You know, as counselors, we used to say that in terms of parenting. The people who need the parenting most will not look at a parenting program or pick up a parenting book or volunteer for parenting classes. So that's a good point, Sharon. Like, how do you educate people who don't know that they need the education, or maybe don't want to be educated?
I wonder if a better answer would be for, well, just simply to get to know a person of color.
I wonder if the way Kendi dismantles all these different assumptions that we have. If that doesn't have an impact, because if we are exposed to that dismantling, it'll help us kind of dismantle it for other people when a question comes up or a
Using our
statement comes
power.
up. Right, because it gives us fodder to use. You know, it gives us information that we can use to dismantle biases and assumptions that people that hold on to but don't know why, because this is hard work. Deconstructing
Right.
a lot of things that we're exposed to and have never questioned. But I think you got to start somewhere, and he does a really good job.
Because
And-
one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, it's not a race, it's an individual behavior and culture. I mean, he talked about that a lot last week anyway. And so, it's just something he's dismantling things, as you're saying, that I think, it's not a race that acts that way. It's individual's behavior. So then I have to, think about that. And
in reading this too, it seems to me that as he's deconstructing a lot of things, in this portion about powerless defense, he's not leaving different races off the hook.
no,
We all share in this anti-racism process
right,
equally.
right.
And I think that's kind of,
Well, because I think on 141, he talks about the powerless defense strips Black policymakers and managers of all their power. The powerless defense says that more than 154 African Americans who have served in Congress from 1870 to 2018 had no legislative power. It says none of the thousands of state and local Black politicians have any lawmaking power. It says the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas never had the power to put his vote to anti-racist purposes. The powerless defense says that more than 700 Black judges on state courts and more than 200 Black judges on federal courts have no power during the trials and sentencing process built into our system of mass incarceration. So, right, he's not just pointing it out for white people, but for all people that they had power. The truth is Black people can be racist because Black people do have power, even if limited. White power can, note that I say limited Black power rather than no power. White power controls the United States, but not absolutely. Absolute power necessitates complete control over all levels of powers, all policies, all policy managers, all minds. Ironically, the only way that white power can gain full control is by convincing us that white people already have all the power. If we accept the idea that we have no power, we are falling under the sort of mind control that will, in fact, rob us of any power to resist.
I'm thinking, going back to what you said earlier, Lindy, I think you said it, or maybe it was you, Matt, about the fact that we have very limited worldviews. and that we don't, our experiences, yeah, that was you, Matt, right? And I think that maybe that needs to be the first thing that we offer in confession every Sunday. You know, that we don't deal well with that the rest of what we don't know breeds fear in us. And take it from there. I mean, that applies to everybody.
Yeah, to confess that we only have 2 eyes and 2 ears with which to perceive the world.
I think that's what these books, White Fragility and How to Be, have really helped me understand is how Black people who are really conscientious and sensitive experience life. The section where he talks about trying to figure out why are white people so evil? Oh, I understand now. It's because they realize they have recessive genes and they're shrinking. You know, it's like, wow, people see that. People feel that way. And
People believe that.
and it helps me understand. Well, it's interesting. Interesting. And
But-
I think
oh,
for a
go ahead.
long time, persons of color have not had the opportunity to tell their stories. And this is certainly an opportunity to hear their stories and to try and reshape our perspectives and our way of thinking.
And it would almost be helpful if there's 6 people here, 3 were people of color and 3 were not, and not, because, so we could hear the stories because I guess, I live in, because I'm retired and I live in a white community, a basically white community, I don't see people of color very much anymore. And so therefore, how does one learn? Go out and, but I'm just saying that it's
Yeah.
one of the ways if we're so, if we live in such a segregated place, we don't know.
I think it's interesting because I live in a very diverse group. It's exciting in the apartment complex that I'm in. Up until a year ago, my neighbors were Haitian, and it was wonderful listening to their Creole French, although through from the windows in the summertime. Because they didn't always have the air conditioning on. They tolerate the heat much better than most of us. And they just are wonderful people. We never, a lot of the things that he talks about, I haven't seen in the people here. They were fortunate they purchased a house during the pandemic and were able to move into their home. And I got a great painting from from Dominique's father, who's a very renowned Haitian artist who was residing here for about 4 months. So I was able to buy one of his paintings that he painted here. So I mean, I don't see that power struggle here in the Lehigh Valley, but we never sat down and talked about it. We talked about the problems in Haiti. That's part of the reason George was here. But they were fully aware. I was really amazed of how aware they were of the political events that took place in Haiti that brought them to the point where they are today.
Mm-hmm.
So they educated me too.
Right. Well, and that's what, when we're more diverse, we can learn. If our minds are open to be to be challenged.
Mhm.
And if you see in this chapter too, is he went through the history of, there's a history of how this country has used, the power and so forth in such racist ways, as we see in our, if you look in how we've used in our country and so forth, how we've used our power in so many racist ways. And it's interesting because some friends we were with the other day talked about they had bought this house, and they said that it was built in the 60s, and in this community they were not allowed to sell this house to anyone from a Mediterranean community. And that's from the 60s. And when you go to sell your house, you could not sell it to anybody from a Mediterranean community.
And
So
who
who
would
was that?
enforce that?
Who was that targeting?
Who was
Italian?
that? Oh, well, who is it targeting? Who is it?
Greeks, Italians, Mediterranean, North
I just
Africa.
wonder who made that a law and how would they enforce it? I
I think Linda froze. Oh,
I'm
no.
froze. Are you okay? Now we're back.
okay.
Okay, I'm going to share this, and I'm putting myself out there. I have a friend who just passed, who just died a month ago, and when he moved to Myrtle Beach, the whole transaction went through smoothly.
Dennis, can you speak up a little bit? I'm having a hard time hearing. I'm a little hard of hearing, so
All right, I'll speak
thank you. That's
loud.
better.
My friend moved to Myrtle Beach. He was buying a house. It went through perfectly until he went to the closing. And when he walked in, the couple that were selling the house realized that he was Black, and they asked to back out of the transaction. And my friend said to them, "Why would you want to give me your house?" And they said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, it is against the law to discriminate in I guess in that state or in the United States, and to do what they're doing because of his race, and I will sue you, and you will end up giving me the house." So needless to say, he was able to purchase the house.
Wow. Wow.
But that's an example of how that still continues today. And that
Yeah.
was only like 5 years ago.
So we have done that. All right. Well, what would it look like if we took the responsibility for and created accountability around racist ideas and policies you supported regarding people within cultural groups you share identity with? What would it loving your siblings as we are called as Christians in the letter to John look like in this context? So what would it be like if we didn't have these racist policies?
So what would we have to do to in other
Right.
words,
What would we have to do?
to do things like if there's a store that doesn't treat black people right, that we could boycott that store or restaurant or whatever and promote that, you know. I don't know.
See, I heard in that question, I hear more because I think this chapter on Black racism was especially him reflecting on Blacks trying to differentiate themselves from other members of the Black community. And in that question, I heard about where do we see ourselves doing that, of discriminating against sort of our own race.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's I honestly think his sort of about like rednecks and white trash and like I think we do, like I think we do that. I know I've done that, especially in the age of Trump. It's been really easy to sort of deflect. Well, those white folks who rally behind Trump are, you know, rednecks or whatever it is. And I think that's part of what the point that he's raising is that's in itself racism, because it's trying to separate yourself from other people, and say that you're somehow above them or better than them. And I think that's, there's some weight to that critique.
There is.
Yeah.
Wow. He's
So
saying,
then-
go ahead. Go ahead,
No, I was
Alan.
going to say, so then, as we talked about earlier, if we're going to combat racism, we need to find people of the different races that we talk to. Does that mean then that we need to go and find rednecks and people who are Trump supporters and who think differently than us and engage them in conversation?
You don't have any of them in your church, Alan.
Oh yeah,
But
yeah.
it's
but
hard
I don't
to not-
engage them.
Oh.
We kind of
But it's
agree.
hard.
We're not going to talk politics.
right,
Well,
but it's
I-
hard to make them to think like I do.
Well, isn't anti-racism everything that Jesus taught?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, what we if you're preaching the lectionary this past week, it was pretty clear that going into this election season, that we really need to focus on loving each other and looking out for each other. So I think if we just stick to the scriptures, we're okay.
And there
But
was
it
a
is-
great add-on recently that said it's not about them or them, it's about us. And I
Yes.
thought we need to hear so much more of that. It's about us, not
I have to confess that when we watched that documentary about Harlan County coal miners, I was just taken aback by the courage of the women in that community who would basically stand in front of an army of strike breakers, all who had guns. And these are poor, uneducated women, don't have much, but I don't think I could have that courage. And so I learned to appreciate it just in that brief time there. I just learned to appreciate them in a new way. I got insights into those people that I really hadn't thought about before. So I think I think that's where he wants us to go with this question, right? That kind of.
Well, and I think to the point that Alan and Dennis both raised, I think when we think about the folks in our congregations, even that we deal with, I think part of the challenge is learning to see past the sort of surface racist behavior or language or whatever it is that we would initially just then sort of put a wall down and say, okay, well, that's not engaging that. But to see beyond that to the power struggle, to the fear, to whatever it is that is producing that behavior. rather than writing it off as, well, I'm not engaging that. I think that's the challenge. I mean, I read reading and listening to this chapter. I thought of actually a specific person in my congregation, who anytime in a sermon where I mention white supremacy will meet me after the service and remind me that white people aren't the only ones who can be racist and supremacist. And usually I try to escape that conversation as quickly as I can because it's after worship and I don't like, but listening to this, listening and reading this chapter, it's like he basically, I think Kendi would say he's right. He's right. They're not the only ones. And so it's learning to understand where his pushback is rooted. What is it that he's seeing or experiencing or hearing or whatever it is that makes him so intent on pushing back against a critique of white supremacy, and trying
Is it
to
because he's one?
I think it's because I don't know that he is a white supremacist that he would know of. I think he probably has some supremacist and racist ideas, and certainly a lot of fear. And I think, but it's just, this was a challenging chapter, especially in thinking about how do we engage and dig beneath the surface rather than just write somebody off for the behaviors or ideas that they're exhibiting and try to distance ourselves from them.
I would agree with you, Matt, and I think that's why he goes to the trouble of pointing out that an individual can be racist, but groups participate and engage in racism. And I think you're right. He just breaks it right down to the interior level. So he wants it to start on a one-on-one, it sounds like to me. Just one-on-one.
And as he closes the chapter, he says, I had imagined history as a battle. On one side, Black folks, on the other, a team of them niggers and white folks. I started to see for the first time that it was a battle between racists and anti-racists.
That's interesting. Mine says anti-racist power.
Yeah, mine does too.
Oh, I have the unupdated version. So,
Oh, okay,
okay.
interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah. But I still think the point is there
Mm-hmm.
that so much is looking at, as you said, looking at individuals rather than labeling a group. I mean, Jesus looked at individuals rather than labeling a group as,
I agree with what you were saying about the people in our congregation struggle with this. Some of them are kind of exhausted on the racism subject, and in that exhaustion, they just kind of like put up and say, we just can't go there. Don't bring it up. Don't talk about it. So there's kind of a resistance because I don't think they know how to approach it from this angle. This makes sense what Kendi's doing because he's dismantling the structure and guiding us through the process. I'm not sure how we can do that in the church. What I've been trying to do is to emphasize those teachings of Jesus that correlate towards, loving each other and displaying the characteristics of an anti-racist to everyone. And
Would we use this book in our
that's-
church? Just asking.
I purchased the new updated copy.
Yeah.
We have a library in our church and I left the old one there just to see if anyone picks it up. But to what you were saying, Den, I've been doing that too. I've been focusing on all of the Jesus-like material that shows anti-racism stuff. The thing that worries me is that we white people are so adept at filtering that I worry that we've had practice all these years. We've been hearing these same scriptures for centuries. And we have just filtered out what we don't want to relate to us. And let's face it, if we are so avoidant of the conversation because of the discomfort it brings us, imagine how tired people of color are in the
Yeah.
fight. You know what I mean? And I don't know how to, I struggle like you do at how to get that across, because I do worry that everybody can too easily filter out what they don't want to hear.
Susanna, I'm just thinking that I think some of the Black people that I've known, they're eager to talk with white people on a certain level. I mean, to talk about their experiences, their personal experiences with the white community and how difficult it's been sometimes for them. And so I don't know that they're completely tired of dealing with it.
I think you're right though, Suzanne. I think what popped into my mind is the anti-racism is a Luke message, and we live in a Matthew world, where our instinct is just to take everything that we hear being preached and to spiritualize it, rather than take it as a message about humanity and living together in community.
Right.
And I think that's we can hear whatever Jesus is saying, and our instinct is, but yeah, how's that about it's a sin problem, and it's my heart problem, and it's whatever it is, it's not a relationship between me and other people problem. And I think that's still going on in our churches, where it's, we don't want to talk about the politics of it. We don't want to talk about the relationships of it. Tell us about you can keep it spiritual. And I think that's part of, I think, the pushback that we get is this is a very on the ground, raw, human subject matter. And it I think people would rather deal in this sort of the abstract spiritual realm than something that hits so close to home.
That's a pretty nice metaphor you use, that we can preach a Lucan message, but they hear it in they live in a Matthean world. That's pretty good, Matt.
Why, thank you, Alan. It's on the record here too. It got recorded. Somebody else will hear this maybe.
Good. All right, let's move on to the class chapter. And on that one, he describes a class racist on 151 in my book. Class racist, one who is racializing the classes, supporting policies of racial capitalism against those race classes, and justifying them by racist ideas about those race classes. And the anti-racist, anti-capitalist is one who is opposing racial capitalism. Okay, well, that's a hard that's a hard sentence for me anyway. Okay, he identifies at the intersection of class and race is rooting the circumstances of poverty and economic disparities in political and economic conditions and policies rather than people on 153. And I like this part. Well, this is on 152. It says, poor people are a class. Black people are a race. Black poor people are a race class. When we say poor people are lazy, we are expressing an elitist idea. When we say Black people are lazy, we are expressing a racist idea. When we say Black poor people are lazier than poor whites, white elites, and Black elites, we are speaking at the intersection of elitist and racist ideas, and the ideological intersection that forms class racism. When a policy exploits poor people, it's an elitist policy. When a policy exploits Black people, it's a racist policy. When a policy exploits Black poor people and the policy exploits the intersection of elitist and racist policies, a policy intersection of class racism. When we racialize class, support racist policies against those rate classes, and justify them by racist ideas, we are engaging in class racism. To be anti-racist is to equalize the race classes. To be anti-racist is to root the economic disparities between the equal race class in policies, not people. So that's a big thought. A lot of, that took a bit of unpacking. But do you see what he's saying there? I mean,
And we all thought we were living in an unclassed society.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I appreciated that you could tell he was drawing a lot from Martin Luther King in this chapter, and in terms of sort of that point that sort of King had honed in on, the unsung point, or less acknowledged point that King had, of that it wasn't just about race, but that race and poverty and militarism all worked hand in hand with each other. And you could tell that he was really sort of drawing from that bit of insight from King to say that this is there's intersectionality that's happening in this when it comes to factoring in the particular kinds of racism that poor people also face, that's unique to those who, to poor folks. And I again appreciated that he talked about how that happens not only for poor Black people, for poor white folks as well. The only place where I was disappointed is that and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that he addressed at all the sort of particular way in which poor Black women get targeted as like welfare queens.
Okay.
I don't know that. I mean, which to me is an argument that I hear more frequently than I would like to, are folks who sort of target Black moms, and all their dads are gone and all they do is have kids and stay on welfare and whatever, collect money. Like that argument, I don't recall him addressing or sort of naming that at all.
he
You
did
mentioned
somewhere.
that-
I can't.
Did he?
I thought he did somewhere,
And
but
then
I can't find it right this minute. I'll try to.
he followed up by talking about the welfare system,
Right.
the welfare, the bias against the welfare state, while politicians and the wealthy take advantage of the policies and things that they can use for tax write-offs, and and he even gives numbers to it in terms of the amount that is for the poor is in the millions of dollars, $4 million or something annually, but it's or $4 billion, but in the benefits that the wealthy people take advantage of is in like 65 billion or more or something like it's just astronomical amounts of money.
Well, then good. I retract my critique. Then I must have just must have just.
And then I'm not sure it's even in this chapter. It might
Okay.
be
It
in
might
another
not- it
chapter
might-
too.
Right, it might not
Okay.
be in this chapter. It might
Okay,
be in the
then-
next.
He talks about how they liked to say it was the welfare system itself perpetuating the problem,
Mm.
but they would point at that and not talk about how all of the rich benefit from the limits on inheritance taxes and things like that, which ended up being millions of dollars versus what was being the assistance that was given through the welfare program.
Right.
Yeah,
And he
he
does
said-
talk about the poverty a lot, it's impossible to know racism. This is on 156. It's impossible to know racism without understanding its intersection with capitalism. It means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated.
What is
I think-
enlightening from this chapter is how the different political decisions throughout the ages have kind of created this.
Right.
And it also shows that whites and blacks struggle with this. And because of the movements he talks about, assimilation and segregation, and how
Well,
those
Right. And on 158, it says, poor blacks in metropolitan Chicago are 10 times more likely than poor whites to live in high poverty areas. With black poverty dense and white poverty scattered, black poverty is visible and surround its victims. White poverty blends in.
Yes.
And I think that's where, Matt, that they may come up with the welfare mothers or something, because they live in they don't, white poverty is scattered. And we don't see it as much. Black poverty we see when we watch the news and things, when they show the cities and people, people on the sidewalks who, it's not usually white people they're showing as out there. So attributing these inequities solely to capitalism is faulty as attributing them solely to racism. Rolling back racism in a capitalist nation can eliminate the inequities between the black and white poor, middle income Latinx and Asians, rich whites and natives. Anti-racist policies in the 60s and 70s narrowed the inequities on some measures, but anti-racist policies alone cannot eliminate the inequities between rich and poor Asians or between rich whites and white trash, the inequities between race class. As racial disparities within the class narrowed in recent decades, the economic inequities within the races has broadened, as have class racist ideas justifying the inequities. So there is, and when you said that, Matt, there is a, there is a bad idea about welfare mother, but where did they learn that? They probably, people that say that, when we say things like that, we probably didn't see them. We heard it somewhere. So that's a racist idea that we picked up from our friends or whoever says that.
It's
I think
sometimes
he
called
does.
blaming the victims.
Mhm.
I think
I think-
this brings up tensions too, because he follows along by saying anti-racist policies cannot eliminate class racism without anti-capitalist policies. And anti-capitalism cannot eliminate class racism without anti-racism. And when you start talking about anti-capitalist ideas, then you've just set
That's
off
trouble.
wrong.
I think he said that's where some of his critics pick up in the book and use quotes like that to undermine his, but yeah. It's
Right. I don't, he uses anti-capitalist capitalism. I realize I share some of that perspective, but I don't label it that way. I say it's the dark side of capitalism. When
Okay.
things like that happen.
yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah.
Looking up the,
I really like that point though that he makes, that it's you can't deconstruct that class racism without tackling both the cause of the classism and the cause of the racism. And I think that's a really good point. And I think part of that is what we see with even what he had raised about how, like, he talked about Trump's economic policy and how Trump's economic policy exists for rich white guys, and how yet he had so many poor white folks voting for him, even though it went against their own best interest as far as economics were concerned.
Yeah.
And the only explanation is essentially because it came down to the sort of the racist piece of it. and so that to act against their own economic interests on the basis of racist sort of ideology is an interesting, it's an interesting double-headed monster, that, and I think he's right to acknowledge that. So you can't just say, hey, don't we got to fix the poverty thing because the other part of it will still exist, and somehow addressing both of those things simultaneously. But I think Suzanne's right that if one doesn't get people riled up, the other one will.
Well, and the one thing that I have picked up from the book is to take a look at, or to be able to see a little bit further back in the steps, maybe not to the origin, but I had to talk myself down from a Facebook post yesterday because somebody from my congregation posted, she reposted something about, they should pay off a person's cancer debt before they pay off student loans, because education's a choice, cancer is not. And I looked at that post and I thought, this is how they divide and conquer us.
Mhm.
I mean, you could just look at the nonsense behind it to make one faction fight another when we're both in the same boat.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just craziness. And but I didn't post anything. It was
Good.
Right, because the post would be something like, well, universal healthcare and free education would solve both of those things.
that was my post in a nutshell, but I didn't do it. I didn't do it.
I like the ones about we got to help our veterans more and not do so much for immigrants. We have enough money to take care of everybody.
Yes.
Well, we might not, but about 8 people in this country
Yeah.
do.
May I ask the question, in reading this, I wondered, where are our congregations on any of the basic topics? Like do our congregations think about capitalism? And how do they define it? And I think they define it in older terms. They don't understand. For example, he makes a comment that he was labeled as a Marxist because of his discussion on capitalism, which plays into that an understanding that most people don't really know what Marxism is. And the other point being that people don't know what other countries' cultures are like.
Right.
What is China? China is communist, isn't it? No, it isn't today. It's not a communist country. It's a socialist, capitalist country. It uses capitalism just as we do here. It is not defined by the red communism it was back in Mao's time. But that's what we all still believe. So I think we have, as a country, many of us aren't really up to date on many of the countries that we view as our competition or adversary.
How
So
hard to keep up with it, Dennis. It changes so fast.
That's true. All right. So another question would be, what kind of alternative economics is Jesus suggesting in his parable of the great dinner in Luke 14, which says, a man prepared a great feast and sent out many invitations. When all was ready, he sent his servant around to notify the guests that it was time for them to come. But they all began making excuses. One said he had just bought a field and wanted to inspect it, so he asked to be excused. Another said he had just bought 5 pairs of oxen and wanted to try them out. Another had just been married, so he said he couldn't come. The servant returned and told his master what they had said. His master was angry and said, go quickly into the streets and alleys of the city, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And after the servant had done this, he reported there was still room for more. So his master said, go out into the country lanes and behind the hedges and urge anyone you find to come, so that the house will be full. For none of those I invited first will get even the smallest taste of what I had prepared for them. So how does this relate to that? I mean, how does this relate to our capitalistic views? What would it be like if our faith community? Yeah, go ahead.
So if the poor weren't invited on the first round, they were already separated from the guests that were coming.
True.
Yeah.
But what it,
Universal health care and free education for all.
Amen.
Is there
Preferably
any-
before student loan payments kick back in.
Yeah. Is there any country that has what's called social capitalism? I don't know. I don't think in my lifetime that we're going to get rid of the notion of capitalism, but I think, as you're saying, Dan, there's an underside, and can we address some of the underside of it? You know, provide for some social supports for
I
those
would
that are.
What
Many,
about
many,
Alan, there has to be.
What
You
about
know- Europe-
Canada? What about
Yeah,
Canada?
many-
Canada, the United Kingdom, Denmark. You know, my neighbor's children live in Denmark, and they've had to have like surgeries and stuff, which has cost them nothing. But that doesn't mean that there isn't capitalism in Denmark. You know what I mean? There's still
That's what I mean, it
companies.
must,
Yeah. And it works. Go figure.
Oh, yes. In England, the same. If you're expecting and you have a child, it doesn't cost you. I know when my children were born, it cost $3,000. Now it's probably 2
30.
times that. I don't know what it is today, but it's very expensive. And over there, they're there maybe 3 days. Here, you're out the next day. If there's no complications, they don't let the mothers rest, really. As soon as the child's ready, you're booted out. So I do know England has socialized healthcare. And people love it, so.
Yeah, it's not the horrors that everybody in
yeah.
the United States like to say it is.
Well, who says that? But the you know, the rich
powerless.
people. Yeah, the
Yeah, the
power
rich.
brokers. Yeah. They
I
convince you
hear
social
that. I hear
media.
that all the time. How horrible it is, and you know, wow.
Yeah.
People have bought into those myths, or basically it's basically propaganda that's put out by the corporations.
Right.
I worked for an insurance company when Hillary Clinton was first assigned to work on national health care.
Healthcare.
And all the insurance companies banded together to work against it. And that's what we have running our country.
Were you when you were doing that, Dennis, were you sort of like a prophet without a country? Or
We were the workers that worked for the company weren't that naive. We said, we don't mind. We wouldn't actually, we were hopeful it would come to pass, because the government can't run the insurance industry by itself.
right.
The employees of these corporations would become government employees. Because if you look at AARP and things like that, those are run by other major insurance companies, but it's AARP's label on it. So you need the people with the knowledge of the insurance policy processes and different variations throughout all the states. And that would take people. So you'd become a government employee, and that's not such a bad thing.
That's true.
But they do work against it, because it does change the whole structure. Because today a lot of insurance companies are profit driven. They're not nonprofits.
And it comes down to power again. Power and profit. All right, let's talk about, in the next chapter is space. And this says, The point is that when we unchain ourselves from the space racism that deracializes and normalizes and elevates elite white spaces while doing the opposite to Black spaces, we will find good and bad, violence and nonviolence in all spaces, no matter how poor or rich, Black or non-Black. And he says that on 169. What about the spaces? What are you know?
I thought it was interesting that he went to Temple and that he moved
Yes.
into North Philadelphia, and he felt he wanted to live there to experience the Blackness of it. I thought
Yes.
that was very interesting. Yeah, it's
Yes, because that is one of the, that's one of the supposedly one of the worst neighborhoods in Philadelphia, there where he was. And he said, that's right. He was going to live among his Black his Black poor neighbors. The dark ghetto.
I looked
mean,
it up.
Go ahead, Dennis.
I looked it up on my GPS to see where he was at because I had a friend who lived in that area around the same time when I worked at another corporation. She was an artist and she lived in an apartment above her grandfather's barbershop. And it wasn't too far from where he was living. She was a little bit further north. But I went there to her. She had an artist studio above the barbershop. And I photographed her photographs so she could send them out to galleries to get represented.
One of the things I think of, I lived down, I say near Drexel. I lived at Drexel when I went there. And that is in the city. And I was from the suburbs of Philadelphia, and we didn't, a lot of our friends' parents wouldn't let them come see us because we lived in the big bad city. And what I learned about that is, it was fine. It was fine. We lived in, we hear all over the news. I guess, where was I just reading, if it bleeds, it leads in the news, and the fires, and you get the thought that people are shot on every street corner in the city, but that's not true. Because I guess the city's big and it's just not, they go to any shooting and say, look at this big bad city. So you do hear a lot of it on the news.
That was my point too. It wasn't as frightening as what he made it sound like.
I lived in what was known as Hell's Kitchen in New York City. And I lived there for 10 years. But the robberies and other things, the muggings that I heard about were over on the east side in the rich.
See, yeah. And he talks a lot about that. He says the idea of on 168 at the bottom, and the idea of dangerous Black neighborhood is the most dangerous racist idea, and it is powerfully misleading. For instance, people steer away from the stigma Black neighborhoods as a crime-ridden streets where you might have your wallet stolen, but they aspire to move to upscale white neighborhoods, homes to white-collar criminals and banksters, as someone calls them, who might steal your life savings. Americans lost trillions during the Great Recession, which was largely triggered by financial crimes of staggering enormity. Estimated losses from white-collar crimes are believed to be between $306 billion a year, according to the FBI. By comparison, near the height of the violent crime in 95, the FBI reported a combined cost of burglary and robbery to be $4 billion. So racist Americans stigmatize entire Black neighborhoods as places of homicide and mortal violence, but don't similarly connect white neighborhoods to the disproportionate number of white males who engage in mass shootings. The
I
point,
remember hearing somewhere that during the race riots, the integrated neighborhoods did not have near the problems that the all Black or all white communities did.
and is that because they know each other and they're friends, or it's
I
their
think so.
neighbors?
I think so.
Because it's, it's probably harder to steal from my neighbors or something than it is, or people I know. I'll pick on. That's interesting that you said that.
I think the other piece is that we just begin to lump them all together, and the people just may not be that way,
Mhm.
whether they know their neighbors or not. They just, people are not inherently bad. Like,
it's interesting talking about neighborhoods in Philadelphia or New York City or whatever, but like this idea of don't drive through that neighborhood or this neighborhood. I remember hearing about Allentown and
Oh, yeah.
Pembroke and Bethlehem, and like I remember hearing that like growing up in
Yes.
Hellertown, and like, hey, make sure you lock your doors driving through this neck of the woods or wherever it is. Like it was and it was the same. It was the same sort of idea, that like that's a dangerous area because that's where the subsidized housing and or government housing and and not white people live. And it was like this chapter, it's like, yeah, that's that I heard that all the time growing up from babysitters and relatives and neighbors and whoever, especially once I started getting like once I had my license and stuff, like that was like the word of advice. So I can remember hearing that.
Do you think it makes us feel better to label a certain group of people and tell people don't go there because it, to give that feeling that it's dangerous or something? It kind of like elevates our community living in some remote area or a country town, gives us feel good about where we're at or something. Is what motivates us to do that?
Or does it just make us feel safer that those are the bad areas? If we can label them, then it makes us feel safer where we are.
Right, because it seems to be something that just keeps happening. It hasn't gone away.
Well, I
It
mean,
used to be the South Side. It was always the South Side. If you were on the South
Oh,
Side,
yeah.
it was the tracks, and then the North. Well, that has changed. Now it can be wherever there's something else like subsidized housing or whatever they.
I think there is something to the sense of denial or just the illusion of safety that we want to maintain in our own heads. And I think that's part of the reason that, and I'm glad that he brought up sort of the mass shooting piece. And I think that's one of the reasons that the mass shootings, especially when it's in like suburban, mostly white school districts or schools, why they get so much attention, why there's so much shock that it has happened, is because it goes against the illusion of safety that we presume to have living in the suburbs. And I think I think those are the incidents that truly reveal the sort of spatial racism that we've sort of taken, that we've internalized, is when something occurs that completely goes against that. and destroys that illusion that we had of those are the dangerous areas. This is a safe area.
Definitely. On 174 and 5, he makes a distinction between segregation and separation. And why is this distinction important? Separation is not always segregation, he says on 175. The anti-racist desire to separate from racists is different from the segregation desire to separate from inferior blacks.
Mhm.
When integrationists use segregation and separation interchangeably, they are using the vocabulary of Jim Crow. Segregationalists blurred the lines between segregation and separation by projecting their policies as standing on the platform of equal accommodation for each race, but separate.
Well, I think or imagine what he's getting at is there are ethnic neighborhoods that people choose to move into because there are people like them. And
Mhm.
they're, we were over in New York the other week, and Manhattan Beach is Russian. Mediterranean is Russians all over the place. So there's a difference between people who choose to move to an area because to be with people like themselves versus the segregated areas where people are not allowed to move there because they're seen to be inferior. I would imagine that's the distinction that he's trying to make.
And cultural, as you said, that's people like me or whatever, that the Irish used to live all in, there's different communities all over.
And
And-
the churches were important centers of each community too.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that is. The on the end of bottom of 174, the integrationalist strategy, the placing of white and non-white bodies in the same spaces, is thought to cultivate away the barbarism of people of color and the racism of white people. The integrationist strategy expects Black bodies to heal in proximity to whites who haven't yet stopped fighting them. After slavery's, okay. Separation is not always segregation. The anti-racist desire to separate from racists is different from a segregationist desire to separate from interior Black. And he talked a lot in here. He says, like many whites who, on 178, like many whites who grew up in the 60s and 70s, I always thought that the ultimate goal of better race relations was integration, wrote somebody. But few of us talk about that anymore. We're not pursuing Martin Luther King's colorblind dream of a more or less race-neutral America.
It's an interesting concept because I know that when I worked with the center during my years at Moravian as an intern, the refugees who would come in, they would want to put them in proximity to other refugees so that they would have some support. So
Mhm.
we recognize that on one level, but if they do it themselves, we still get caught up in that, well, really, they should try to be like us in this country. So then they're isolating themselves and not trying to be like us. I mean, I think that's where what he's talking about when he talks about people's attitudes toward, I'm probably not saying it well, but that's difference between separation and segregation. You know, we look at neighborhoods differently if they're for us. And I still think that, and I have to catch myself, not just in this, the points that brings up about race, but in other things. I have a tendency to think that, you know, people think about religion like I do. They don't. Or, you know, think about foods the way I do. They don't. But that it's because we are intrinsically who we are. We're in this space. And it's important to be aware of that. You know what I'm saying? Probably not.
But is it okay? Yes,
Yeah.
but don't you think it's I was thinking about like a university has the students of the Jewish peoples thing, or they have the Black group,
Yeah.
or the I don't know, you could pick a religious group or whatever. Although but don't I think in this chapter he's talking about that's sort of a safe space for them.
Yep.
And it should be a good space for them.
Yep.
Of course, then, you know, I bet you would hear the racist idea of, you know, you couldn't have a white space. But, you know, but I think he's talking a lot about that. They're segregated, you know, but to make a safe space. And he's saying that there's so many white safe spaces that, you know, and the money.
I think she froze.
Yeah. You froze up, Linda.
Yep, she did.
Yeah. So
Let's give
if she
her.
doesn't unfreeze,
Justice.
there she
Warren
comes.
Brown.
There,
You're back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You
Okay.
froze for a minute there, yeah.
Oh, okay. Um, in other words, you know, that can Black spaces be equal to white spaces?
he
So
takes a
maybe
lot
we
of
can't force it.
he takes a lot of time explaining how we seem to lean towards one way. Even
Yes.
Barack Obama wrote only white culture could be neutral or objective. So there's like a bias in our culture that we kind of all buy into. But isn't he kind of, with all these examples, kind of setting up a question, is that the real way to approach this? Shouldn't we all be able to have our space?
Yeah.
And we'd say
Uh,
yes. I mean,
Well, I mean, how much of this connects to thinking of our churches as safe spaces where everybody is welcome when they historically have not been welcoming of everybody, right? And like the explanation for this is why the O&A process, or this is why, you know, like why these processes are important for truly doing the work of making sure our spaces are safe and for everybody. I think there's some correlation as I'm listening and thinking of this chapter between what he's saying about sort of separate spaces that have to do with um, safety and being at home and being yourself, and some of the work that we do for you know, thinking about the LGBTQ community and the way that they experience space as well. And I think there's a lot of overlap there, especially when we think of our churches. Because I think we would say that I think most of us would say that our churches, it doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter who you are, you're welcome here. And the question is that actually true?
It
And
might
how do
be
we
on a
and
Sunday
how do we
morning.
know? Like,
It might be on a Sunday morning, but what if they decide to stay? You know? I think like what you're kind of going toward, I think, Matt, is when I look at this difference between separation and segregation, I feel like he's taking it back to the person again, and he's talking about motivation. What is your motivation for being in a separate space versus separating from versus segregating from? That's how I took it anyway.
And maybe you can't force it, like, because they tried to force it before, like when they began the segregation of the schools and,
But again, the motivation for that was clearly not positive.
Okay.
So separating out, being able to choose your space is very different in motivation than being segregated from a space. You know what I mean?
Sure. That's good.
So what does he mean by to be anti-racist is to equate and color difference among racial groups?
Your question broke up.
yeah,
Dennis.
Dennis, can you say it again?
Oh, to be anti-racist is to equate ethnic and cultural and color differences among racial groups. He makes that statement towards the end of the chapter. Which leads me to believe that he's looking for us to all accept. He says to be anti-racist is to support the voluntary integration of bodies attracted by cultural solidarity, a shared humanity. So it makes me believe that he's supporting people gathering as groups and not feeling like you have to assimilate or feel
Right.
like you are segregating or separating from each other, but you can do this and have your own space.
Yes.
Right.
And that's okay. And I think he's kind of like deconstructing all the beliefs that we've had even up to Barack Obama's administration of trying to blend as one, which was even part of Dr. Martin Luther King's worldview at that time. So this is different.
Right. Right. Any other thoughts before we close? Because 8:30. So I guess Bonnie will be facilitating next week. So I would say finish the book, finish the book or review the next chapters for, I'm not sure what you'll do, but, finish up on that, because I thought it was the survival chapter that we're going to talk about is very good too. So that'll be great. So thanks for being here so we could do this.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
for leading
You're
us,
welcome.
Linda.
So it'll wrap up next week.
Yes.
Okay.
So yes, she was gonna be back for wrap up.
Okay, thanks again, everybody.
Okay,
Thank
take care.
you.
Have a good night. Okay,
All right,
Good
bye.
take
night.
care.